6 years after the camera stopped, 14 people walked back into a research lab and lay still while a machine measured what their bodies burned doing nothing at all. The number came back about 700 calories a day below where they had started. Not below where they finished, below where they began, 6 years earlier. That measurement became one of the most quoted findings in nutrition science, and it arrived with a ready made headline: Extreme dieting breaks your metabolism permanently. The headline is wrong, not the number. The number is real, it was carefully measured, and it has held up. It is the story attached to it that falls apart. And it falls apart because of a second result, sitting in the same dataset, that turns the whole thing inside out. The setting was a televised weight loss competition. 30 weeks, 16 contestants, a restricted diet, and a heavy daily training load. 14 of them agreed to be studied by researchers at the National Institutes of Health, measured at the start, at the end, and again 6 years later. By the end of the 30 weeks, they had lost an average of about 58 kilograms each, roughly 130 pounds. 6 years later, they had put about 41 of those kilograms back on. Now, one distinction and everything rests on it. A smaller body burns less energy. That part isn't mysterious. There is less tissue to run. So the researchers didn't only measure what each person burned, they calculated what a body of that exact size and composition should burn and subtracted one from the other. What's left is the part that being smaller doesn't explain. That leftover has a name. It's called metabolic adaptation. 6 years out, that leftover was about 500 calories a day. So the obvious story writes itself. Their metabolisms slowed. Slow metabolisms make weight come back. That's why the weight came back. It's a clean story and the researchers tested it. Because testing it is what the data was for. If a slowed metabolism drives regain, then the contestants whose metabolism had slowed the most by the end of the show should have been the ones who put the most weight back on over the following 6 years. They weren't. The relationship wasn't weak, it was absent. Knowing how far someone's metabolism had dropped at the finish line told you essentially nothing about how much weight they would regain, which leaves 500 calories a day sitting there, real and unexplained. So the team looked from the other end, not the slowing at the finish line, but the slowing 6 years later, set against how much weight each person had actually managed to keep off. There was a relationship there, a clear one. It just ran the wrong way. The people who had kept the most weight off were the people whose metabolisms had slowed the most. Not the least, the most. Read that as a sentence about bodies rather than statistics. The best outcomes in that group belong to the people whose resting metabolism sat furthest below where it should have been. Whatever those 500 calories represent, they are not a punishment handed to the people who failed. They are concentrated on the people who succeeded, which means the question was never why their metabolism slowed. It's what those particular people were doing that the others weren't. A second paper followed the same 14 people and measured something the first one hadn't put at the center: how much they moved. Not how much they said they moved, measured, using doubly labeled water. You drink water containing traceable forms of hydrogen and oxygen, and researchers track how quickly each one leaves your body. The gap between the two rates tells them how much carbon dioxide you produced, which tells them how much energy you actually spent. It is the closest thing physiology has to an honest audit of a person living an ordinary life. The people who kept the weight off had increased their physical activity by about 160% and were still doing it 6 years later. The people who regained had increased theirs by about 34%. Both groups moved more than before the show. One group moved enormously more and never stopped, and that is the group whose resting metabolism had dropped the furthest. There's one more number in that follow up, and it is the one that quietly settles the argument. The researchers took two things and only two: how much each person ate and how much each person moved, and asked how much of the difference between their 6 year outcomes those two things accounted for. The answer was about 93%. 93% of why one person was still far down and another was back near where they started, accounted for by intake and movement. That doesn't make the metabolic adaptation imaginary. It was measured repeatedly and it is substantial. It means the adaptation was not the thing steering, it was riding along, a consequence of how much those bodies were being asked to do, not an independent force deciding who succeeded. The slowing was real, it just wasn't driving. So here is the reading that fits all of it, put forward by the researcher who led the original study in a paper revisiting his own data years later. Your body doesn't treat energy as an open account that simply spends whatever comes in. It behaves more like a household with a fixed budget. Add a large permanent expense in one column, and the other columns get trimmed to keep the total inside its range. For most people, this never becomes visible because most changes in activity are too small to force any trade off. Walk a little more, and you simply burn a little more. But push activity far enough and hold it there for years, and the body starts finding the money elsewhere. It runs the resting machinery leaner. Fewer background repairs, a little less heat, a quieter engine at idle. That is what 500 calories a day looks like from the inside. Not a broken system. A system rebalancing around a permanently higher cost of living. I want to be straight about where this sits. The measurements are solid and they have been repeated. The interpretation is not settled. Other researchers have argued that part of this apparent adaptation comes from how the calculation is done, and that argument is live in the journals right now. What isn't in dispute is the shape of the data. The slowing was real, it lasted 6 years, and it clustered on the people who moved the most. Which brings us back to 14 people lying still in a lab, 6 years on, with a machine telling them they burned 700 calories a day less than they used to. For years, that number was read as a receipt for a punishment, proof that something had been damaged and that the damage was permanent. Set it next to everything else in the same data, and it reads almost exactly backwards. Those 700 calories are what it costs to hold a body below the size it used to hold. And for the people who held it best, while moving more than 2.5 times as much as they used to, every single day for 6 years, it isn't the injury. It's the bill for the thing that worked. And the people who don't carry that number, the ones whose resting metabolism came back up to roughly where it started, are, for the most part, the people whose weight came back too. The absence of the adaptation isn't the healthy outcome, it's the signature of a body that went back to doing what it did before, which makes slow metabolism a strange phrase to use as an accusation. In this group, it wasn't a verdict on anyone's discipline, and it wasn't a fault in the machine. It was a measurement of how much the machine had been asked to do, and for how long. And one thing worth saying plainly, this is a description of what was measured in 14 people under unusual conditions, not a PR addiction about anyone watching. 14 is a small number, those were extreme circumstances, and the only person who can speak to any individual body is someone able to examine it. If you want the next one, it's about a system your body runs constantly, and that almost nobody has had explained. Subscribe and it'll find you.